help me understand how much energy does it take to train a generative AI model, and how much energy does it take to, you know, each one of my chats, or if I search using generative AI, how resource intensive is that process?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I mean, AI is very seductive. All new technologies are, but they all have externalities, costs that we need to be aware of. And the environmental impact of AI is certainly one of those. So the chips that AI uses are more complicated than your average everyday chip, and they require more energy, therefore, because they're graphical processing units. They require about 10 to 15 times the energy of a traditional chip. And so that gives you some sense of how AI compares to other uses. The recent class of generative AI models requires a 10 to 100-fold increase over the previous generation. So the way to think about that is that overall demand is doubling about every 6 months. And then there's the amount of data that AI takes to train, and it's simply not a sustainable amount of data. Data use in the world is doubling at the rate doubling every 2 years. And so the amount of materials that it would just take to build the servers to store all that data is about a Mount Everest worth of materials. There's a physicist, Melvin Vopson, who says we're experiencing an information catastrophe as a result of all of that data. And so in addition to having a significant carbon footprint and traditional energy use, AI is also very thirsty. So according to one study out of the University of Riverside, training ChatGPT took 185,000 gallons of water. And that doesn't end with the training of the model. Every time we go and do a query or have a conversation with an AI system, let's say that conversation has about 20-ish or 20 to 50 back and forth exchanges with the ChatGPT. Well, that's the equivalent of taking a bottle of water, an 8-ounce bottle of water, and just sort of pouring it on the floor. It uses that much each time we're having that conversation.
Um, is this, well, I wonder first, I'm curious about the ethics here, but I wonder first if we could kind of unpack that information catastrophe quote. Uh, we have sprawling data centers across the country and across the world. These are obviously pretty resource intensive, just to power the cloud and current searches like on Google or Bing. What type of scale can you put these in comparison? I know it's not precise, but I wonder if you can help me understand um, the scale of, when we're talking about an information catastrophe, how much larger are we talking?
Well, the information catastrophe comes from just the amount of data that's being generated. So when you think about how much is being used there, that same physicist that I quoted says we'll run out
Sure.
of energy in about 100 years. So just to give you some sense of the impact of continuing at the rate that we're going. So something's going to have to give. And in fact, I think corporations and regulators are looking at the issue and are starting to be aware of that and start thinking about those things as well. In terms of trying to
Yeah.
think of the scale of an AI model, one comparison is that training an AI model uses electricity and energy consumption that's equivalent to the same CO2 emission of 5 average American cars throughout their lifetimes. So, just to try and help people put it in consumer terms, they can think about they drive 5 cars over how many years, and that's the equivalent of training one system.
Um, Often we kind of think about the training is like, well, it's one and done. Maybe that was resource intensive to get to a certain level, but once it's done, it's done. Uh, but we know that these companies are perpetually training new systems. Is each one more expensive than the previous?
Yeah, and that's why that statistic about the current generation of
Yeah.
AI models compared to previous ones is so stunning. And it's also true that once you've trained the model, many models are designed so that you have to go back and fine tune them. And so that exercise again takes more energy. And then there's just the iterative use of them. Every time you're asking it to provide an inference for you, each one of those inference uses or queries of ChatGPT is using energy again.
How can we prioritize sustainability and still take advantage of generative AI?
Well, as I say, there's a lot of people that are starting to think about the issue. And I think the first thing that has to happen is the tech companies themselves have to ID it as a risk. At the Markkula Center, we interact with technology companies all the time. We are working alongside of them as we write case studies, and we actually are brought in by some companies to help them problem solve or develop policies and practices themselves. And we know through that work that they have these very long lists of ethical risks of AI, but that the environmental impact is not currently on the list. So the first thing we have to do is get it on the list and have people be willing to acknowledge that it's a concern and a trade-off. And that needs to happen because the younger generations, Generation Z and the millennials, as consumers and employees, are absolutely demanding that companies address environmental concerns. So there's not really going to be any getting around that. And there's regulation that's coming in the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive out of the EU, is going to start to require companies to disclose a lot more use. Beginning in the spring of next year, for example, companies are going to have to comment on their water and their carbon footprint. And, one of the things that we hope that companies will start to do is disclose how much energy each AI model is using. That allows both consumers and companies to start making decisions. And our term for it in the ethics world would be discernment. For the consumer, it might be really, do I need to keep doing these frivolous queries just to see what ChatGPT will doing if I know how much water, for example, that it's using? And for the companies, there's a couple different ways they can change their practices. They could decide not to integrate AI to the degree that everybody's talking about it right now. It should be integrated into everything. Well, maybe we need to be more judicious about, making those decisions. They can decide to use somebody else's large model system if they need one, rather than building one from scratch. Or if they are going to build one, they can contain it to using data that they already have, because that uses less energy than the models that have to be built from the very beginning.
It's really hard to talk about ethics and morals and what is right or wrong, especially when we're talking in broad terms. But we can certainly look at some of this data and look at the outcomes, just like you mentioned with business leaders. How should business leaders, with an eye to ethics, or at least with some sort of uh well, I'm trying not to use words like conscious, or there are traps built in here. But if I'm a business leader concerned about climate change and my business's impact on climate change, how should I ethically approach artificial intelligence?
So the phrase that gets used in industry right now is responsible AI or responsible
Yeah.
technology. It's sort of this idea of developing technology and taking responsibility for its impact on the consumer, on the environment, on even other companies. And so that's actually been a well-established position of technology now for many years. And it's very encouraging, actually, when we work with people inside of companies to see the amount of energy that's been devoted to that resource. It should give us all some hope. Now, it's also susceptible to economic downturn. So with the last set of contraction in the industry, some of them went through layoffs and things like that. Certainly the AI tech teams in some companies took a hit. But I think the commitment is still there. And again, I cite the requirements that the younger generation of employees and consumers has, the expectation they have of that companies will address these as a primary motivation for companies to be responsive. So I think they may not use the word ethics when they're talking about it, although many companies do. They have tech ethics teams now, which is a real shift from maybe 10 years ago, when ethics and compliance in companies really was just compliance. It really was just looking on what do we do to
Yeah.
follow the law and to stay out of trouble. It was less about the more reasonable and thoughtful consideration about the impact of what we're doing. So, a lot of these companies wouldn't use words like the common good in talking about
Right.
what they're
Sure.
doing, but that's what they have in mind, right?
Hmm.
They're thinking about their impact and how they contribute to the resources that we all share as a community.
Um, how responsive are the large tech firms when you talk to them about these issues?
Well, there's some leadership coming out of the companies themselves. And so, as I say, I think they're starting to identify the issue. Microsoft has actually made a statement that they're going to start developing more energy efficient systems. And so I think the part of the way we'll have greener AI is in innovation in the AI systems themselves. They're addressing and coming up with new ways that allow the systems to work, but use less computational power. And less computational power means less energy in the cooling of all the data centers that are running all that data. So there's sort of downstream effects from just the models themselves to the way and the places that they're processed.
Yeah, so that's actually a really big question. Are these systems, much like our own personal computing systems, we can see them becoming more efficient and more powerful over time? Do we see a similar trend paralleled in uh, artificial intelligence systems?
Yeah, and we can see, widespread impact throughout industry. I mean, from
Mm.
whether a company like Cisco needs to build new networking equipment that allows the applications to be processed more quickly in the data centers, to the actual use of the systems themselves. There's ripple effects, and so everybody is gearing up to respond to this increased demand in AI and this increased innovation. So you want the innovation, but you want the innovation in a measured, reasonable way. And so thinking about things like the data centers, where you're even building the data center, is the kind of consideration that companies are undertaking to try and minimize their impact on the environment.
How responsive are government regulators?
So there's a lot of work that's being done around the world in AI regulation. I think right now the EU continues to sort of lead the world in terms of regulatory leadership, and there is an EU AI Act that's coming online in the next couple of years, where they've tried to address at various levels of risk the kinds of responsibilities that companies will have and the kinds of things that are simply not permissible. And so we're seeing that in the EU, and here in the United States, there are conversations underway in the Senate and in the House to sort of consider, well, what should we do? And there's been a lot of discussion, for example, about creating a new regulatory body that would have oversight on AI technology development. I
Last,
think
oh,
so.
go
No,
ahead.
go ahead. I was going to say, I just think there's ways that regulators can be creative, and they can require sort of companies that are creating the AI systems to disclose that information, but they can also require companies who are using AI systems to talk about how much energy and water consumption the use of those AI systems is undertaking. And they could think about something like setting limits. There's been some discussion about setting limits on the computational power level that's permitted, or they could, sort of go the route that the FCC did with broadcast radio stations, where they limited the number that each entity can own. Regulators could set limits on the number of AI systems, for example, that companies could use at one time.
Are these reasonable and realistic?
Yeah, I think certainly the disclosure requirements are very realistic. And it's usually where you see
Mm.
regulations start with, first, let's get our arms around the scope of the issue. And once that's known and it's put out there, people tend to start reacting to that even without regulation. I mean, it starts to become a point of reputational harm if you're putting numbers out there that are so significant that the average consumer can figure out this is a problem for the environment.
Last question. When we talk about artificial intelligence, or at least part of the broader conversation has been about existential risk, what do you, where do you place the environmental consequences on this scale of existential risk? On the one hand, there's paperclip maximizer and robots running the world. On the other hand, there's real issues like disinformation. Uh, where on that spectrum do you put the ecological cost?
I put it pretty high on the priority list and pretty near term on the spectrum. So, I mean, after the summer we've just had in this world with environmental impacts and fires and floods and everything that we're seeing, it's hard to ignore anymore what the earth is crying out for in terms of responsiveness from human beings. So the impact of AI on the environment, the impact of anything on the environment, is a near-term ethical urgent matter. And it has to be, I think, taken up pretty seriously by companies and regulators in a very timely manner. It's a high priority.